Hello, bonjour tout le monde. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. I have the real privilege of being the project director for LEARN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LEARN is a partnership between academics, refugee leaders, civil society partners in many places around the world, but particularly driven by the needs and opportunities identified by our partners in the Middle East and East Africa. The goal of LEARN is to try and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime, and through research, knowledge mobilization, training, and policy engagement, we're trying to shift the balance in the refugee regime to ensure that those most affected by displacement, that their knowledge and perspectives do a better job of informing research, policy, and practice. Before we begin, let me acknowledge with gratitude that the land on which I live and work is the unceded ancestral territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I say that not only out of respect and out of protocol, but out of a deep recognition that the themes of displacement, dispossession, these questions of power and seeking to address these inequalities that are present in this conversation are very much a part of the history of the land where I live and work. And I acknowledge with gratitude the opportunity to live and work on this land. With that, let me say how delighted we are to have such a strong audience and a wonderful panel for this fourth webinar in the series with the IDRC research chairs on forced displacement. IDRC is Canada's International Development Research Centre, and for several years now, they have been leading in tangible steps to address inequalities in the field of refugee and forced migration studies, notably by funding 12 research chairs in universities across the global south, spanning from Peru to Thailand. We're very fortunate to have two of the chairs with us today, along with Susan Martin, who I'll introduce in a moment. The goal of the network of research chairs is very much to try and shift the narrative in refugee and forced migration studies and policy and practice, to ensure that we benefit from perspectives that can define new opportunities to advance the question of rights and solutions that are really central to collective efforts in response to refugees. So let me say how fortunate we are to work with IDRC and how grateful we are for this partnership. Before I begin with the webinar, let me begin with an apology. You will have seen that Opportuna Kweka from the University of Dar es Salaam was scheduled to moderate today's discussion. I very much regret that Dr. Kweka is unable, for personal reasons and health reasons, to be able to join us today. We send our best wishes to Opportuna. I was saying to Susan and Paula and Mary as we were coming in that perhaps it's appropriate that this white man who's rapidly becoming old sits in and listens attentively to this discussion on questions of gender and rights. I think it's a conversation that is of critical importance for everyone, and it's really my privilege and pleasure to be able to step in to moderate today's discussion. Let me say a few words on, from a technical perspective, on netiquette during this webinar. That this webinar is in the view-only format. There will be a time for discussion and questions from the audience later in the program. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose a question, which I will then curate after we have heard from our three speakers. Let me also say, if you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send an email to learn@carleton.ca, and Jerickson and the team who are in the background will be able to help you out there. I also invite you to join the conversation on social media. So if you have thoughts or responses to what we're hearing, join us on the social media platform of your choice, but the handles for the platform formerly known as Twitter is either @learning or @FDChairsNet, where you can join this conversation, but also the conversations that come out of this webinar. Let me also note that the webinar is being recorded, and that a recording of the webinar and a short report will be posted in the coming weeks on the Chairs network. So to learn more about the Chairs and to access the recording, please visit fd.chairs at Carleton. So with that, let me just say a few words of introduction to this, our fourth and final webinar in this series. In this series, we've looked at issues of a roots-based approach to migration, new approaches to protection. We've looked at issues of climate change. We've looked at issues of internal displacement. These themes have been selected by the chairs as an opportunity to engage with global policy discussions. Our fourth webinar is on the topic of gender, geopolitics, and forced migration. When this topic was selected many months ago, we had no idea how salient and topical it would be. And we are profoundly grateful to have with us three speakers who I will introduce in turn, who will be able to help guide us through some of the dimensions of this topic and how we can situate questions of gender within the historical and geopolitical context in which we now find ourselves. So we have three speakers. Our first speaker is Susan Martin, a great champion of these issues and a great champion within the field of refugee and forced migration studies. Susan is an emeritus professor of Georgetown University and a leading voice on issues not only of gender, but other dimensions of forced displacement. Past president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, joining us from the west coast of the continent where I am now, where it's very early in the morning. So Susan, let me say a warm welcome and a thanks to you. Susan, the floor is yours.
James, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to this webinar. Could put up the PowerPoint slides, please. Okay, I'm going to try to give a fairly brief overview of issues related to gender and displacement, mostly focusing on how these issues, how the UN system evolved to think about gender and how it's affected by displacement and vice versa. Okay, in terms of the gender perspective on displacement, it's important to look at issues related to gender inequality as both a cause of displacement, but also a result of displacement. So the lack of economic, political, and social opportunities, not only for women, but for other minorities, is an issue that really leads to displacement, and it determines very much what the patterns of displacement are, whether there's an over number of young men who are moving or older women having to take care of the children of their children, and so gender comes into these matters in quite a number of different ways. And migration itself results in both greater vulnerability for many people, again, women particularly, but others as well. But also it can lead to greater empowerment. And we have to look at both sides of the issue. So these issues are very much in how you look at gender and displacement are very much determined by feminist theory and how women have looked at the issues over time. And during the early period in which people were, like myself, were really trying to think about, okay, where does gender fit in? Where do women fit in? A lot of the attention was given to what is often called an add women and stir understanding, where there was a push for sex disaggregated data and comparisons between men and women, but not very much more than that. It was just adding women to the statistics It went from there to identifying the special needs and situation of women so that it would be easier to start to address their needs. But it was, again, in a fairly limited manner until the next phase was to analyze what were structural and systemic gender inequalities that define the male and female roles, relationships, and impacts. And that became a little bit more structured in a way in which it was possible to then think through what were the steps that needed to be taken to address not only the immediate needs of women or LGBTQ or other populations, but to be able to think through a more holistic approach that understood the systemic issues that overlaid the entire endeavor. It then went from thinking specifically about male-female and looking at it in a sort of a bubble to recognizing the importance of intersectionality. And these were efforts to understand how gender intersected with other really important issues, and particularly for those who were claiming asylum, for example, understanding how gender intersected with race, religion, economics, and other ways in which people are either resilient or vulnerable was important because gender itself, as I'll talk about a bit more, was not a it was not a basis for persecution in the refugee context, and particularly in terms of the Refugee Convention. And then where we are now is taking all of these previous issues and moving away from a binary concept of male for female to allow more nuanced interpretations of gender roles and relationships. And of course, in some countries, such as unfortunately my own right now, in the US under this current administration, that concept is under great danger of getting lost because of just the term gender is now one that you can't even use if you want to get funding for a project or anything of that sort in the US. It's important to understand the impact of gender inequality. As I said before, it's both a cause and a consequence of displacement, because displacement is very highly gendered. Education, economic status, things of that sort factor in greatly to where people can move, when they can move, how safe the movement is. And too often, gender and class are issues that really affect just how far you can get out of harm's way. And for women in particular, women tend not to have the financial, human, or social capital that is needed in order to be able to move to a place of safety. And they're less likely to move longer distances than men are, and particularly if you're going from a developing country to a wealthier country. And then the same problem occurs in terms of destination countries. It's also highly gendered. So generally actually favoring women are policies prioritizing family reunification as a principal pathway to getting to some area of safety. And this, again, is more likely to happen in North America, Europe, Australia, et cetera. But there are also other paths that people can take that don't involve displacement, but involve more regulated immigration. But these are also gendered in terms of where you can get work permits for what purposes. And so in some cases, women are what are considered women's positions get you going, but in another case, it's done. And then access to asylum is limited, both because of the laws in some countries, but because of just, again, the cost of getting there. And so a lot of movement for women, particularly in cases of disaster or conflict, is through distress migration or displacement, rather than what we would hope it would be, which is safe, orderly, and regular migration. Okay, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has, over the years, developed many policies that relate to gender. It started particularly with women, with the UNHCR policy on refugee women. I'm not going to go through all of these things. The 1991 Guidelines on Protection of Refugee Women, though, was a major step forward. I say this with some modesty because I wrote them, but these were really aimed at having on the ground improvements in the protection of refugee women, not just in law, but in actual practice. And many of these other ones that I'm talking about deal with specific issues that women faced. But over time, again, it moved from being specifically about women to being, by 2011, I kind of ended it. I could have added more policies to it. But in 2011, the intersectionality was more clear, and we have policies dealing with broader groups, age, gender, and diversity. So what do we need to do? And I'm going to leave it mostly to Mary and Paula to fill in some of these gaps. But we do need to close the gap between the rhetoric and reality of women's participation and decision-making. And that goes, of course, also for all refugees and displaced persons. And LERRN and other groups have been doing a lot to empower women, to get them at the table when decisions are made about the things that are going to affect them and their families. So we need to, but we have to work a lot more in that area, and I hope we'll have time to talk about it in this context. But then there are also things that need to be done to reinvigorate the international responsibility sharing, so that there is more international cooperation to reduce vulnerability, and to also reduce the length during which people are displaced, so that we can find durable solutions for them. So systemic reforms are absolutely necessary. But next slide. Having specific programs to identify some of the needs of both women and men, particularly their vulnerability to violence, is very important. So that needs a multi-sectoral approach, ones that involve bringing together all of the sources of vulnerability and addressing them holistically. Also providing culturally sensitive services, so that, and I'll talk a little bit more about the physical and mental well-being in a minute or so. But we also need to do more to hold perpetrators accountable. Unless they're they are held accountable, it's unlikely that we can stop the process of violence and sexual exploitation. And we need to work with all persons, regardless of gender, on prevention, that it's not just a woman's issue, or an LGBTQ issue, or any one specific segment. It has to be holistic. Then addressing trauma and increasing resilience is very important. It's easy to say, and I firmly believe that refugees and displaced persons are amongst the most resilient population on Earth. What they've gone through is something that nobody should have to do, but the fact that many of them, most of them, are able to get through the process and make lives for themselves is amazing. But we have to understand not only the risk factors, but the protective factors, meaning the things that let people do well, even in these contexts. Need psychosocial programs, promotion of human rights, and understanding of that. So women and others who are vulnerable are able to understand their rights and work off of that. And then there are a lot of religious and indigenous coping strategies that are important, but there are also a lot of ones that are not very beneficial to women. So that has to be dealt with very carefully. Okay, a very important issue is, of course, access to reproductive health services. When I started working on looking at with UNHCR and others on women's issues, there really were no reproductive health services offered to refugees, or they're very, very sparse. But now there's a commitment to making sure that refugees and displaced women are safe in giving birth, get family planning services, there are now prevention programs and treatment of sexually transmitted disease, and a special attention on adolescents who are usually amongst the most vulnerable during that period of time. Financial self-reliance is absolutely essential to be able to be resilient. And that involves various different training programs, microcredit and entrepreneurial support, and for a wide range of entrepreneurship, not just ones that are women specific. Access to non-gendered labor markets so that women have the same opportunities as men do to be in computer programming programs and things of that sort. Providing education to all displaced children, including girls. That's one of the sources of vulnerability. And making sure that we do have sex and age disaggregated data that can be used as the basis for helping to provide the opportunities for women. Water, sanitation, and fuel are always problems in displacement. There's still a need to reduce the reliance on firewood as a source of energy. It's often leads to too much problems, too many problems for women who are generally the people who do get the firewood. So it's a protection problem, not just a firewood problem. But same goes for access to clean and sufficient water. It's again a women's job generally, but women getting that water can face problems, and there need to be other ways of dealing with it. Waste management, shade trees in places like the photo where there's very little cover, and ways to promote planting of vegetable gardens so that the women and families are not so reliant on the food aid that comes in. Next. Okay, and then really important is to be forward thinking. We need to do a much better job of forecasting mass displacement and knowing where people are going, when they're going, how they're going, and what the vulnerabilities are for different categories of people during that process. We need to develop legal and operational frameworks to provide legal status for displaced persons. If they're internally displaced, they're citizens, but not necessarily seen as such. If they're refugees crossing a border, we need to make sure that they have a legal status. If it's not full refugee status or asylum, at least one that gives them access to services and some protection. And we need to invest in resilient building development programs. And because without having some mechanisms to help people get through the very serious problems that they're experiencing, these problems will only fester and make it even more difficult. So we need to look at it as a preventive measure as well as a solution to displacement. And I think that may be the last slide. But one quick word, the Refugee Convention does not have gender as a cause of a reason that people may be vulnerable, may be refugees. And that there's a lot of efforts to try to get past the fact that it's not in the convention, but they're too often. The problem is that governments do not consider gender-based persecution or gendered forms of persecution to be a route to asylum. And that remains possible. And again, my government goes back and forth depending on who's president as to whether there is protection for gender-based violence. And that shouldn't be that we really need to start fixing that problem. So anyway.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. And what a tour de force presentation, not only in providing us this deep understanding of the history of efforts to respond to this, that this is not a new recognition, going back to 1990 and the work that you did then and have continued to do. Your understanding of this not just being sort of an add women and stir approach, but really understanding this within the structures not only of displacement, but the structures of power, and very tangible recommendations on where efforts can be invested in moving us forward. But I think a really helpful link to Paula's presentation is this understanding really of first of all, how responses to gender issues and displacement needs to go beyond engagement with women, right? That it is very much a question of structures and powers within communities, but also how your presentation really helped us understand that this is within structures of global structures, right? The need for international cooperation, the question of inclusion, exclusion, and these questions of power inequalities, not only at an individual community-based level, but very much at a structural level as well. And so thank you, Susan, for that. And that links wonderfully to the presentation from Paula Banerjee, who's going to look at these questions of geopolitics and structures and really help us think more deeply about the context within which we can engage with these questions of gender. Paula Banerjee, known to many for her 30 years of leadership within the field. She is the IDRC Research Chair on Gender and Forced Displacement at AIT in Thailand at the moment. She's the founding director of the Center on Gender and Forced Displacement and has held, like Susan, a former president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, and has done so much within the field, within her region, globally, in encouraging us to really think more deeply about questions of gender, questions of power, questions of decolonization within the field. Paula, it is such a pleasure to have you with us. I'll pass the floor to you now, please, and I believe you also have slides.
Yes. First, let me thank IDRC for arranging this webinar and also thank ISFM because, as you've heard, Susan is one of the former presidents of ISFM, one of the most noteworthy presidents and, a person who has, brilliantly steered ISFM for a very long time. And then I was also there, and Mary is probably one of the future presidents of ISFM. She's also very much present there. So, it's kudos to ISFM. However, I have to also thank two particular people, lots of people, but two people for today's talk, because I was going through personal, challenges. And the two people who helped me to put up this PowerPoint, one is Ari Baskoro, who is my research assistant and a student of mine in AIT, and Dr. Shucharita Sengupta, who very generously gave me all the photographs, that are reflected here, who also works on forced migration. And I'm very proud to say that she is one of my mentees. So having said thank you to all these people, I would like to begin by saying that when I talk of gender, I don't automatically, um, sort of transfer it to women. So I'm mindful of the fact that gender means a lot more. So all the men who have not come here to listen to us saying our thinking that this is just about women are wrong, and they will miss a lot. Having said that, I'm thrilled. As James said, he's a white man who is moderating. So I'm thrilled that a white man is forced to take notes of what I'm saying. That seldom happens. So thank you, James. And,
I always take note of what you say, Paula.
and James happens to be a great friend too. And speaking after Susan Martin is also a very proud moment for me, because I consider her as one of the few people who've really, really shaped my ideas on displacement. And Mary is always one of the brilliant younger colleagues. So this is really a very nice setting for me to speak. Having said that, I will talk about, masculinization, feminization, and let me begin by making a few statements. Number one, when people are displaced, whether man, women, they are usually staying within the region. So there's no way, nothing for the global north to be nervous about, because we host them most of the time in the global south. Only those who have resources are able to go to the global north. So please don't worry. You will only get people who are litter of the cream among the displaced population. Secondly, when we talk about institutions, and I think Susan very courageously, because she is right now living in the belly of the beast. Nice to think I'm in the belly of the beast, but she very courageously said that with changes in precedents, the situation for women change a lot. So I will begin from that position and say that all these institutional structures that we talk about, whether it's government, whether it's religion, whether it's state, whether it's even family, is extremely discriminatory towards women, and that is across cultures. So, one of the reasons why when we talk about gender, we zero on women and other vulnerable populations is simply because of that they are vulnerable. So if I talk about the vulnerable population and sometimes keep mixing it up with women, it's because of their vulnerability quotient and lack of power position. So they are perforce, because of structural issues, distanced from the power. So keeping this in mind, I will go on to what I want to say. Next slide, please. Yes. So Susan sort of showed the way and started with the 1990s. I will also continue with that. So the geopolitical shifts that happened in the 1990s suddenly brought back, post Soviet Union, it suddenly brought back this notion that geopolitics matter. So during the Cold War, the hot war, whatever, we knew geopolitics matter. But after that, the shifts that started happening, you stopped looking at, the alien that would invade you, but rather started looking at the aliens at the border. So the border became an extremely contested space, because there was no longer the two big brothers watching over you when you were not worried about what wars are going to happen as a result of that. So you sort of tended to become more concerned about the borders and the neighbors and the region, etc. And as a result of it, what happened was that the women, and borders are never really fallow lands or empty lands. So the women who were there in the border became the bodies on which these contests were taking place. Post 1911, biopolitical triage, as I say, is becoming a very territorial contest. And this notion of geopolitics, this notion of gender, and this notion of migration is somehow in a very toxic dance with each other. And, statecraft suddenly became biopolitics, suddenly became one of flesh. And whenever we have a return of biopolitics into geopolitics, women and men matter in a different way. So gender began to matter in a different way. And we saw that in the post-Kosovo period. We saw that in that conflict where rape was used as an instrument of warfare. Now, rape was used as an instrument of warfare I'm sure, in parts of Africa much before that. And of course, there are evidences that it was used in parts of Southeast Asia. For example, in the conflict of Bangladesh, women were perforce impregnated. So that was biopolitics, but we never really bothered about that because, it's one of my favorite R words, and that's race, resource, and religion. These were the three most important things that we have been forced to reckon with. And this did not happen in the white part of the world. So people didn't care about that. It was much later, during the conflict that was happening in Europe, that we came to figure out that it was, it was important. Gender was mattering, although it was mattering for a very long time. So therein is mixed this notion of race within it, which is so potent. We forgot colonialism. We thought post-colonialism means a sort of a stop to racism. It has not stopped. And the Ukraine war again has suddenly brought it to our face because we've seen what, how asylum is treated with Afghans, Syrians, Myanmaris, people from Sudan, Gaza, which is such an important example. And yet, from Ukraine, it's a different case. I'm not saying Ukrainians should not be given that kind of a welcome. Of course, they should be. That should not be the reason for us to bring them down. It should be the flashpoint where we say that is the ideal where we have to take the refugees too, or the forced migrants too. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. So you see, borders become this very masculine space, this very virile space. And it is also space where power has to be made visible. So that is why, even for United States, what happened was that you start talking about the Canadian border. The Mexican border was always in the rhetoric. You start talking about from crying out loud. I mean, there is so much to be done, and yet you're talking about Greenland, and you're talking about expansionism, and what happens with this masculinization of the border is that capital is encouraged to flow. I mean, whether you look at the Trump government, any other government, you will see capital is encouraged to flow, but the bodies are not. And, in that sort of a situation, the bodies become very contested. And we are just over a pandemic. If we are, I don't know. Scientists, their views are sort of contested. But what happens is that with the coming back of the body, suspicion now centers on images such as biometrics, etc. The subject, the so-called alien body. Pandemic showed us that all bodies are connected because the vector is airborne. What we have learned from pandemics that you have to use biometrics, you have to use racism. The aliens are always from the global south, etc. So it seems we haven't learned much. So the feminine migrants are having two, therefore, pretty important sort of markers of difference. One is their gender. Other is, of course, the racial factor, which makes them as unwanted. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. Now, the question is conflict that are happening. And this is also very interesting. When we were just getting over, the pandemic, when there were signs that we are getting over the pandemic, we kept on talking about, climate change, climate change, climate change. Here, suddenly, whammy, we have geopolitics. So that shows how securitized the world has become, how important geopolitics is in terms of security. And whenever there's a question of security, that has this toxic relationship with gender, because security is posited on this relationships with gender. And that is why, in our rhetoric, women are no longer the victims and the collateral damages, but rather the suspicious bodies who can bring in a vector, who can bring in, their sexuality is to be blamed. And, even now, we are talking about women hiding arms, women doing this in Gaza, obliterate Gaza so that you can build resorts or whatever it is, And that's a place where largely women are. And what are these women doing? They're supposed to be sort of, giving security to unwanted elements. So multiple reasons, bodies become extremely suspicious. And if you had the power, which largely even now, the world in terms of power quotient, it's the men who control power, and women are distanced from power. Anybody in power is saying bulldoze over it, bulldoze over the women. It's the harbingers of all these problems. Sexuality becomes a very, very important factor. So spatial, sexual creates the geopolitical violence. Next slide, please. Yes, and as a result of the pandemic and then the geopolitical situation, we have this heightened surveillance of women's bodies, of men's bodies, of bodies in general. And that is why, we reconfigure this entire thing about social distancing. At one time, migrant workers were considered as essential workers. During the pandemic, that rhetoric completely changed. They were, in fact, the people who had to be socially distanced. And I come from a part of the world where we have seen untouchability. So social distancing institutionally means something so different. So for us, it's very, very scary. And migrant women are particularly essentialized. And that is why we saw millions of migrants stopping in the border, huddled together, sprayed with, insecticide. So you see how crucial and how toxic race relations, border relations with gender have become. So the pandemic brought back all these concerns, all these fears, and now, it sort of brought back this notion of geopolitics by showing the connections of the world. So what do? You try desegregating the world. By desegregating the world, you pretty much institutionally make borders more masculinized, and women who have always been in the lower ranks of power, and other minorities, indigenous people, caste groups, class group, really poverty, all things come together to build South within the South, the least powerful. We do not, we have enough Foucault in us to know that we shouldn't say powerless. There are capillaries of power. These are at the lowest rungs, these people. That doesn't mean that they're not striving. We have seen how they're fighting back, how they're organizing. But, I think Susan very correctly pointed out to the institutional approaches that can change the gender dynamics or the dynamics for migrant people. I would say those institutional changes will only come with people's politics. And really, somebody way more intelligent than me 100 years back said, workers of the world, if you want to liberate yourself, you have to unite and liberate the world. That is the only thing we have learned. Women have to get together. Women have to liberate their places. And women, unless women really change this power configuration, migrant women will not be able to change that power configuration because migration makes them powerless. Being born as women, whether in the global south or in the global north, what is happening in Ukraine? The war is going on, and women are actively getting displaced. The men are kept back to fight. Young women are kept back to fight. So women are being forced to go to other countries with their children. That is also a kind of discrimination. Women may not want to leave their land, but they are being perforce sent away. And what is happening is Gaza. We all know, we are scared to talk about it. We have to stop being scared. We have to get together and we have to campaign against masculinist right-wing forces. Without that, there is no redemption, there is no change. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paula. What a powerful way to end it. And I think with your presentation, taking us from the discussion of the policy efforts and the recommendations within the bounds of the refugee regime that Susan gave us, your presentation really made us realize that if we don't also engage with the structural environment with which these interventions are happening, from the question of borders, from the question of power, from the question of the global capitalist system within which we function, that we're arguably not engaging with the depths with which these power inequalities manifest themselves. And I think that is a very powerful reminder of the scale of the challenge, and to not, and I think your final point in not shying away from the magnitude of the challenge that we have to confront. So thank you, Paula, for that. And that takes us wonderfully to Mary's presentation. Before I introduce Mary, let me remind everyone in the audience that we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion. I invite you to put any questions or comments that you have in the Q&A box so that our speakers can respond to those points. And I know that, Mary, your presentation that looks at this interface between questions of gender and practices of extraterritorialization and externalization policies is going to really sort of bring us to these very critical sites where these points are to be observed. And as Paula's point was talking about, presentation was talking about borders being gendered, I think even more so when we see the consequences of the external projection of borders into various regions. So let me just say how delighted I am to have Mary with us. Paula introduced you as a future president of ISFM, so let's see what Paula's prophetic powers may have in store for us. Mary, it is such a joy to have you with us. Mary Setrana is the IDRC Research Chair in Anglophone West Africa. She's the director of the Center for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana. Mary is involved in so many networks and advisory capacities where she is working tirelessly to build this interface between research capacities and knowledge with those policy actors engaged in the design and implementation of policy in a regional context, at a continental context, at a global context. Mary, Mary's full bio is there in the chat. So in the interest of time, let me just say, Mary, it's wonderful to have you with us. We're looking forward to your presentation. Mary, over to you, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, James. Let me thank Susan, Paula. Paula, thank you for the prophetic word. I think I'll just see my pastor to bless that one. Thank you so much. And I think you have already laid the foundation for my presentation, you and Susan. Particularly, I also stand on your protocol concerning the issues of women. We are not talking about only women, but I think, as Paula said, is because they face most of the vulnerabilities, and majority of displaced persons are also women. But we do acknowledge the vulnerabilities that other men also go through, and we will try to highlight them as they come up. And so with this particular one, as James has said, James, thank you for the kind words. I'm talking about externalization policies. And so please, can we go to the first slide? So within the externalization policy, and also, my first slide, I talk about what are the key issues, and most of them have been raised by Susan and Paula, but in order to set my context, first of all, we need to acknowledge that the assumption that most refugees are economic migrants it's a myth. We need to understand that. And I think, as Paula said, most of the people that are moving, or most people who are displaced, are found within the global south context. So you pick the continent of Africa is the same. You pick other south, global south continent is the same. So even because we are thinking that refugees, people who are displaced, are moving. Those who are moving because of economic reasons, we tend to ignore the fact that even refugees or people who are clearly moving from conflict zones are treated as such. And so we tend to ignore whether in practice or in policies, we tend to ignore the fact that not every person moving is moving because of economic or economic benefits or greener pasture, but because a person has been moved as a result of conflict, or as a result of climate induced, or as a result of all the natural disasters that we talk about. And so, I mean, but as Susan said, most of these are because of the origins of refugee regimes. How did it start? I mean, the idea of Europe and global south global north trying to create policies to address issues of refugees, but not necessarily considering the fact that the global south was also part of the process and needs to be acknowledged. And so narrowed, as I said, the concept has been used narrowly. When we talk about displacement, it's usually narrowed. But when you look at the context, I'm using West and Central Africa, where I'm the chair, as an example, but this is all over. I think if you look at Paula's presentation, and if you listen to Susan, they've already mentioned that. And so the statistics shows that West and Central Africa hosted about 11.2 million forcibly displaced persons and stateless people. Including that, we have 7.8 million internally displaced persons, 1.6 million refugees and asylum seekers, and 931,200 stateless persons. So it tells you that the displaced persons move beyond just recognizing refugees and what economic migrants are being categorized or narrated as, to include all these other dimensions. And so we need to expand our conceptualization of it to embrace the others that have been considered within the framework. Again, there is also the neglect of the complexities and inequalities. Because of the agenda, if you look at the history, as has been said, because the agenda was towards trying to solve a certain problem with clearing it within the global north context. And so we didn't think about, policy context didn't think about the gender inequalities, the power inequalities. And I think that has also been said by Paula about the fact that there are inequalities. Most of the global south countries are hosting these number of displaced persons without acknowledging the fact that there are power dynamics, the inequalities, financial inequalities, the power inequalities, the gender inequalities. And I think most of the things we are talking about goes down to the gender inequalities, and which we are discussing in this context. And so women from the global south, as I have said, are typically understood and represented as invisible, powerless, and helpless. And these are not just things that we are seeing in practical terms, but they also have some effect on the way the practicalities of the policies we have and the programs that we implement. And so looking at the statistics, over 6.7 million women and girls were forcibly displaced or stateless within the West and Central Africa. And so these statistics shows that, yes, indeed, although we are talking about everything, we are talking about all vulnerable persons, women also carry most of these burdens when it comes to displacement. And so we need to acknowledge that, but we should not only see them as, we should see them as people of influence and of power, not only in being invisible and powerless and helpless. That's something I want to also emphasize. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, so flowing from that statistics of a majority of these displaced persons being women and also other vulnerable groups, I try to give some state of affairs. So recently, I led the evaluation of the migration policy framework for Africa. And some of the indicators are what I'm presenting here from the findings. We looked at gender disaggregated data when it comes to displacement and migration. And we noticed that hardly do countries within the continent collect data on gender disaggregated information. So they collect data generally about how many people have been displaced, how many people are here, but when it comes to getting down to the details of how many men do we have here, how many women do we have here, who is having access to education, access to livelihood, we realize that data is hardly collected on these numbers. And so we can't have an idea what is existing for us to even progress with policies. However, we also notice that from the data, there is progressive steps on provision of services to different categories. Once there is provision of services, countries are making effort. We need to collect the data to help us make informed decisions. And then the other thing is the state of ratification of AU Refugees Convention, which also aligns with other international conventions as they were outlined. Here, the data shows that 46 member states have ratified the AU Refugee Convention, which is good. However, 8 member states have signed, but not ratified. At least it's a good number, but we still need the others to be able to sign and ratify. Then the last one, which is of interest to this discussion, is implementation of laws and policies to protect the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, IDP settler persons. We notice that when it comes to policies and laws, most of these policies are either gender neutral, gender discriminatory, or gender biases, or what we call gender silent sometimes. So they don't talk about it, but I mean, if you look at the patriarchal nature of it, then you could see where this thing is moving to, or the end point of these policies. And out of it, one of the questions also answered is that only 6 members have intentionally integrated gender issues when it comes to displacement and migration. And so looking at this, I mean, yes, the ratification is not enough. While we are talking about active engagement on the ground, the policy angle is also missing some of these things that we are talking about. And this is the first point that we need to address. Please, the next point. Right. Okay, so based on what I just presented, I question myself, and these are things that we are still reflecting on. Given the artificial nature of gender-aware policymaking and bigger preservativeness at a global scale, is a gender-responsive refugee and mobility regime possible at all? But that is something to discuss. Please, the next slide. All right, so now to the issue of externalization of refugee and mobility policies. So Africa and West Africa in particular have been a major destination. If you have been following the trends in terms of migration, you notice that it's become a dumping ground for the externalization of European refugee policies and border regime. And this is something that increasingly is taking form in different shapes and in different dimensions. Please, let's move on. And they have implications on the way forcibly displaced persons, particularly women, who are majority of these numbers, experience their livelihoods and experience their daily lives in wherever they find themselves. So how are these externalization policies reflected? So they come in the form of either physical relocation of asylum procedures to third countries while still applying the law of the externalization state, or legal transfer of asylum procedures to third countries in addition to territorial transfer. Provisions for the return of those seeking protection to the transit countries through which they have passed. Then the next one is provisions for development in the context of humanitarian development security nexus. And so within all these, I think as Paula has said, Paula elaborated on some of the things. So these are the dimensions, trying to push away the international conventions that talk about, yes, receive people of displaced persons or experiences and give them protection. Consistently, we find that within the continent, the African continent, these issues or these protection issues are being transferred from the global north to the African continent. We all heard of the Rwanda case, the UK Rwanda case. Although that one didn't feature, we also know that in the background, there are a lot of there are still negotiations from European countries transferring some of these persons or forcibly displaced persons into Rwanda and other countries. Now, the most recent one is return and readmission policies. So in the name or in the light of helping you to develop, there are policies or there are agreements that are asking for legal pathways, regular safe pathways. But underneath it, is what you have to deal with, which is return and readmission. So trying to push away the issue of protection of people who need protection from zones that are conflict or zones where they have been displaced and face all kinds of trauma. These kinds of protections are being pushed away from where they are supposed to be. I mean, also emphasizing the fact that the Global South is also seen as a place of hosting, while the Global North is seen as the rich, bedded countries. So we need to provide a new host to bring them there. So I'll be focusing my attention also on the fact that in terms of development, we are also seeing increasing numbers of development aid that are trying to control our borders in the form of improvement in advanced technology. And so Paula talks about the biometrics, she talks about the surveillance. All these are ways by which our governments are receiving, when I talk about government, I'm talking about the African continent, receiving to help improve border control. But these border controls, as has already been said by Paula, tend to then weaponize, tend to criminalize people who are using the borders, irrespective of the experiences and irrespective of the reasons why these people are moving. Please, let's move to the next slide. All right, so what are some of these impacts? So we've seen that increasing externalization is also increasing violence at the borders and even within the countries of where these, the host countries. So the use of violence have themselves increased vulnerabilities, racialization, and unequal power relations. If you look at the African continent, most of the borders within West Africa, for instance, are artificial. I mean, not even most, but all of them. These are things that were handed through colonial legacies. And so you find that within a particular border, people are having farms, their livelihoods are on the other side, and their houses are on the other side. So people have to live in between borders. And so bringing up these forms of control at the border and trying to control people moving, it affects the livelihoods of these people. And so people who are, for instance, if you take the Ghana-Burkina Faso border, we have had centuries of Burkinabes living in the northern part of Ghana, hundreds of years. However, when these conflicts happen in Burkina Faso and they have to rush through to Ghana, the idea of the fact that they didn't go through the right borders, when they have just crossed from a family house to another family house, becomes a problem. And these are because borders are being controlled, borders are being managed. And so I remember in the field that in one of my field work, the people asked me, what is irregular? Are you talking about the irregular? You are saying irregular because the government is not manning it, or irregular because we were using it before the government came in with the idea. And so the borders that are being called irregular did not exist some years before. And people use them, people run for safety, people run for security on the other side of the country when they need it. And these are families that have been separated by borders, but consistent control of borders also creates these inconsistencies and these vulnerabilities, and particularly women face these challenges. Again, it's not only women that are facing it. We have also seen that some studies along the Morocco border also weaponize male migrants. And so if you're a male person seeking asylum somewhere, maybe across the borders of Morocco, the technology is set, or the biometric is set in such a way that it criminalizes the male migrant, and so does not give you access. And so these are some of the challenges: increasing violence as a result of in the name of development or advanced technology, but then criminalizing the people who need the very help that we need to give them. Again, the effect of COVID, which was also highlighted by Paula, women face extra burden, particularly with their families, because of the COVID and the fact that they couldn't have access to services. Again, the externalization, gender-based violence has increased. And so, as I said, because it's not recognized, the males spend more time at the border, the women are even not recognized at all. And so they even go through several challenges of gender-based violence. And the statistics, when you look at the UNHCR data, to show the increasing number of women who are being abused at the borders. Please, the next slide. All right, so there is also reproduction of colonial hierarchies. Again, the externalization, it takes us back to what we thought we have been free from. And so in the name of humanitarian development, security nexus, women, one state lose their power, and that also affects our men and women in these situations. And so when we go back to the colonial hierarchies, which we thought we had taken ourselves off, and so that is also a challenge. So it's not only about the border issues, but again, it takes us to the rule where we wanted to be ourselves, we wanted to ensure free movement, but now the free movement again, or the fact that people can seek safety or seek protection elsewhere is being curtailed by the externalization policies. Again, we also notice in the various, this is particularly from Ghana, Nigeria, surrounding the work that we have done, we noticed that there were, because of the recent insurgencies in Liberia, there were cross-border displacements, which cross-border displacement is a new term which we are trying to accommodate within West African region, because people cross borders, not going through the asylum procedures, but these are people who have moved from another country to the other. And we find that the empowerment, we talk about women empowerment, we find that both the men and women empowerment are temporal. So depending, because they are in a displaced situation, women who are displaced as a result of maybe landslide, flooding, easily find work to do, find alternative livelihoods compared to men. And at that point, the men have to depend on the women for their existence. And so we notice that there are some temporality in terms of space and time when it even comes to the livelihood and well-being of people who are displaced. Please, the next slide. All right, so in trying to bring my speech to a close, I note what I'm trying to say is that externalization of whether refugee mobility policies as well as border regimes are not a response to the oppression and subordination of women, girls, boys, men, and children in forced displaced situations, and it must be challenged. And thanks for this moment that we are trying to brainstorm around that. Again, from what I have presented, and also some of my colleagues have already said, that we need to recognize and make space for women, forcibly displaced men, women in displaced situations, to exercise their agency, because and I think Susan mentioned the resilience. Women are already resilient, irrespective of where they find themselves. And so we need to recognize that, and we don't only need to romanticize it, we need to make it practical so that women can participate and exercise the agency for development purposes. Again, we need data. It seems data is also something that is lacking. We need to be intentional about documenting the experiences of the displaced persons when it comes to data. Again, we need to mainstream. I think, as Susan said earlier, we moved beyond that. But on the continent, mainstream is it's coming back again. And so various governments and AU at the AU level is encouraging mainstreaming, where countries are being given step-to-step procedures for them to mainstream. But in doing that, I suggest that we connect it with intersectionality so that we can address all the other intersectional factors that come together with the gender issues. Again, we need inclusivity. That has also been mentioned. We need women to be part of policy making, and thanks to LERRN for giving us opportunity to be part of this. And I hope that we will be able to achieve something out of it. And my last point, I say, forced displacement is not a problem to be solved. Neither is it an African or a global South concern, but a global situation that needs to be managed to enhance well-being and reduce the vulnerabilities of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. That is such a powerful way to end the discussion. Thank you all for your interventions and for leaving such ample time for discussion with the 20 minutes that we have left. Mary, your presentation really, your final point about, forced migration being constructed as some kind of deviant act. I think, Paula, it goes back very well to your presentation, and it reminds me of the human beings have been moving for 250, 300,000 years. It's only, you know, the imposition of borders and the colonial project of borders is a far more recent phenomenon. So if you want to make the argument, you know, who was here first, movement or borders, you know, the historical precedent goes to movement. But that being said, you know, Mary, your presentation really left us with these recommendations that link well to Susan's points about mainstreaming, about cooperation. Paula, in your presentation, there was very much that call to remind us of the colonial and neo-colonial structures within which these interventions are happening. Mary, this was an important theme within your presentation as well, is to be mindful of these colonial inheritances. But then also, you know, the challenge of taking this intersectional approach. And Paula, in your presentation, you reminded us that it's not just gender, it's class, it's not, Susan, in your presentation, you know, it's not just gender, it's legal status in the ability to participate and move. So the first question that I'd like to pose to all three of you is, in the particular moment where we are within the global refugee regime, where you know, never in my 25 years of studying the refugee regime have I thought of a moment where cooperation is such a difficult prospect, where funding for programming is so far beyond the realm of the possible. In the moment where we are right now, we can think about these different levels where intervention is needed, right? So, Paula, you encourage us to think very much at that structural and global level. Mary, in your presentation, and Susan, in yours, there are these responses that are needed at a global level. But given the global context that we're facing at the moment, where do we focus our efforts? Is the global still the level at which efforts are needed? Mary, in your presentation, and talking about the innovations that we've seen in regional contexts with new norms being adopted, you know, not only in refugee protection, but the Kampala Convention on Internal Displacement. I think of the Cartagena Plus 40 process in the Americas as well. It seems that in the absence of a center of gravity at a global level, that regional contexts might provide some opportunities. Of course, in a Westphalian world, national policies are going to always matter. Susan, you mentioned about how different national jurisdictions can determine whether we consider gender-based violence or women as a particular social group, and therefore included in the 1951 Convention's definition. But Susan, you also mentioned, you know, the importance of participation and this participation revolution. And I think in all three of your presentations, we're reminded that those who've experienced displacement, those who are most affected by displacement, they don't wait passively for external actors to intervene, right? They take action. And we see this in work on refugee-led organizations, community-based interventions. So let me ask the impossible question. And you don't get to say all of them. So given the distribution of power that we see right now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where do you see our interventions and collective efforts being most fruitfully directed? You know, global discussions, regional, national, or Susan, in your point about really acting in solidarity with and supporting refugee-led, women-led, community-led interventions, which are going to endure despite the external shock. So we have this paradox. The scale of the issue is deeply structural in nature. But which of those levels can we see, do you think, the most fruitful kind of interventions? Who wants to start us off with the responses to that? Paula, go ahead.
This division between local and global is a false positive, according to me. And it is done because there is vested interest in it. The global south is always the global south. Our voice are never magnified as the global, and we are always speaking for the local. And I remember our debate with Lauren Landau, where he said that the global north always makes theory. So that is why today I did not talk about empirical details. I talked about theoretical spaces. And unless we can change the rhetoric by, what we have to be selective about are issues. It is not local or global. And there is an onslaught of right-wing masculinist forces against women and activists who are working on it. And so we have to garner our efforts, gather together wherever we can to oppose those efforts. So, and we are not the only people who are affected. I remember that poetry where you say that first they took the communists, then they took so and so, and last it was me left. So unless we get together and drive it hard through a very peaceful but overwhelming protest movement, we will not be anywhere to make protests in another couple of years.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just trying to call up the words to that poem, and I'll ask Jerickson to post that for everyone because I think it's an important reminder. Susan, please.
Yeah, my first reaction was to your question was what you said we couldn't say, that it requires all of the above. But I think, I understand where you're going, James, with that. But frankly, I think we can't afford to miss any of the global to local efforts, and because otherwise we're going to miss what we need to have in place as an effective strategy. I do think, though, now, without U.S. leadership, other countries actually following that way of thinking about the issues, I think we really do need to put more emphasis on the local and the regional issues, but particularly in the local, because when public opinion begins to shift on refugee or displacement issues, and when there's a sense that there's not only a humanitarian issue involved, but also a much broader reason to be positive with regard to admission of refugees, whether it's in the global north or the global south, I think changes do get made. And I think that we do have to strengthen the ability of refugees and displaced persons to speak for themselves, to be at the table when decisions are being made, and to form around them a cadre of others who will support their efforts, because I think that that's the likely way we'll finally get through some of the political machinations that are going on that are reducing the level of protection for refugees. That's on that level, though. But if we're going to deal with prevention, so that we're not talking about, people being displaced for years and generations on that, then we do have to work at the global level, because that prevention is not going to happen unless there's more coordination and collaboration amongst governments to stop it from happening. I mean, one of the more recent the long-term recommendation that it's getting a little bit of traction right now is to sort of push the idea of a displacement analysis that has to go into every policy that's being made at the national or global levels, so that we understand better what the implications of sanctions are of certain forms of conflict, things that it's taken into account as a serious ramification of these issues. And if we can't stop the action from happening, we could at least be better prepared to deal with it. So it's sort of like the environmental studies that are done impact
the impact
study,
assessments.
displacement impact study.
Yeah. So in other words, before, the plans are drawn up for intervention or sanctions or actions like that, that there's a calculus in terms of what consequence that would be on displacement.
Yep.
Thank you. Mary, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So I think we cannot do away with partnership, international cooperation. These are very key. And although I don't so much like everything about the Global Compact, I feel the whole of government approach and the whole of society approach is important. I think that definition of bringing them together, it's something we can apply, which also means that we need to work hand in hand. I'm actually attending a UN and AU meeting where we tried, I'm just coming back to James, should we focus on the regional? So we try to focus on the regional blocks within the continent. Now the problem is trying to align the regional with the continental, and it's a big problem. So I think we need to work, it has to be in tandem. We have to be on the same level. We need to push the agenda at the same time so that we don't have a problem of trying to push one to another level. And so I think that for me, we need to talk about them. We need to push the agenda at all levels at the same time. If we have limited resources, we shouldn't invest in one and leave the other. And then the other one is media narratives, because we haven't mentioned that, but media narratives strongly influences the way things are done and the way policies are made. I was trying to evaluate the migration policies and displacement policies. I noticed that the things that are practical to us, women not at the table, add and stay, these are things that reflect in the policies and the programs that we implement. And so the narratives are so important. You see the categorizations. Now everybody's talking, we don't talk about refugees again. At the EU borders, we are talking about economic migrants, but these are refugees. These are people moving in search of protection. And so the media narrative is very, very important, which also fits into the bigger policies. I think we need to include that. Then my last point will be decentering. Decentering what? It can be policy, it can be knowledge and acceptance. So I think, as Paula said, Global South, we are proud to be Global South, but we need to change and decenter. But in trying to decenter, we need our partners in the Global North to accept what we are decentering. And so that is something that these 3 points, bring the partnership, the media narratives, and the decentering with acceptance from our partners. This is these are my recommendations for that question. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Can
I
I
think that,
just add one word,
yes.
James? Not just decentering, but also decolonizing.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you, Paula. No, and I think your point, Mary, that it's not just sort of recognizing, but it's that accepting, right? And so much of the work, Susan, back to the question of participation, it's not just recognizing power inequalities, but it's accepting, those with greater power within these systems and relationships to be able to recognize the value in relinquishing, in sharing in some way. And that leads to a second question, and I'd like to, give you each maybe 2 minutes on this point before we move to a conclusion. In the chat box, in the Q&A box, and in your interventions, we've sort of highlighted these examples of where we have seen progress, these tools that we have. So, for example, the mention, not only the struggle to have language on gender and protection needs of refugee women in the Global Compact on refugees, all the work that went into achieving that, the work in having a recognition of the value of refugee participation in paragraph 34 of the Global Compact on refugees. But in the chat box, we've also had questions about tools like UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and sort of the recognition there of reimagining, rape as a weapon of war and the role of women in responding to conflict and how that speaks to the securitization debate. And then finally, on sort of the way that a gendered understanding of climate change, for example, sort of shows how, perhaps these changes are possible. So a final question to the 3 of you is really, where do you see the tools that are there in terms of agreements, in terms of progress perhaps arguably in other spaces. What are the tools that you think we can make better use of that have been perhaps overlooked or undervalued? Are there tools that you feel that are at our disposal that we haven't been using, and we need to dig them out of our toolbox with more enthusiasm? I'd like to give you each a chance for that and some final words before we move to a conclusion of the webinar. So does anybody want to take be first on answering that question? What tools do we have that we may have forgotten about? Paula, do you want to go ahead? Oh, no, Mary, we'll go Mary and then Paula and then Susan will end with you. Mary, go ahead.
Actually, I was going to say Susan listed them, so she should go ahead. But please, somebody should take it. I'll come last.
Susan, you've been nominated.
Yeah, well, I was interpreting the question to be not so much what are the issues, but what are the tools that are that we might be able to use. I think that, yeah, frankly, on protection and on prevention issues, I think that we have just started to think about and look at how we can use some of the modern technology in order to be able to have a better understanding of what are the what causes displacement in various different places, and how do we have a better understanding of why people are moving, where they're moving, how they're moving, and with what consequence they're moving. And I think that we kind of put prevention aside and concentrated on deterrence rather than concentrating on how do we address all of the issues that cause displacement. And how do we know what's actually happening soon enough to be able to put in place responses to it? So I would say that one of the tools that we haven't really, successfully incorporated into the way in which we deal with displacement and with the specific needs of women, other groups, is in front of us. We hear about it every day, but I think we're mostly people who have, see humans and have a humanitarian approach to things, not a technological approach. And I think we need to think through what in that range of technology is needed in order to protect people.
Yeah, no, that's a very helpful point. Thank you, Susan. Paula, I think we're coming to you next.
Yeah. Okay, so I will flag participation. Why? I'll tell you. Because, there are so many things that is within our experiential corpus. In the grassroots levels, if you look at my country, my region, women make peace. In Northeast India, we've had enormous experiences of organizations like Myra Palbis, like Naga Mothers. These names are problematic to remember, but take it from me, they have been making peace for decades now. They are in grassroots peace movements. But yet, whenever we bring it to the international forum about putting, having women, not putting, these women should be automatic choices. Inevitably, we are infantilized. It's like people telling us, hey, you take the stage. You have all women participants. These are so patronizing, so paternalistic, and that puts my teeth on the edge. So I think we have to take experiences of women very, very seriously because they have a lot of experience. We are talking about translating the local to the global. It's the women's experience that we should translate from the local to the global. And, just by being women, that doesn't automatically make them think differently. Often their experiences being distanced from power, of struggling through those places where it's full of adversity, but yet you sort of get to have your say. You sort of enter that space. Once I asked Advait Saeed after my visit to Jerusalem that, what is the answer? And he said, when we cannot find any answer, it's usually the women who find the answer. So take women's experience seriously, and women have to push forward and say, yes, I matter, my voice matter, my experiences matter. And that is the only way where I think we can go forward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paula. Mary, last word to you, please.
James, I was thinking of the tools in different ways, so I'm not sure which direction you want, whether policies or programs or generally, but maybe if I get what is going on, it could come from any angle, right? Okay, yeah. So I'm thinking, I was also thinking in terms of women active participation, women representing on decision making, not just as the numbers as the others there, but also being active in the decision making. But again, the role of CSOs, I think the role of civil society organizations is also one of the key, which is usually missing at the global, whether global or within the regional levels. And so we need to enhance the capacity of CSOs to advocate for the voices, the migrants themselves. Either it could be migrant associations or the displaced persons associations. So for instance, when we're doing the data collection across all the countries, we needed the refugees and IDPs to help us enter into their communities. And they had existing associations. So these associational leaders are the ones who helped us enter into the communities and into the camps. So I think relying on either refugee associations or IDP associations or CSOs that work closely with them, it's also one of the things that we can bring to us on the table. And I think the issues, one thing we are finding out also in our data is the use of technology either to remit or to communicate. And so irrespective of the displaced connections, you find that the displaced persons are still remitting back home. They are remitting to families around, not necessarily where the home country is not peaceful. They are remitting to their families elsewhere. And so they are taking advantage of technology, whether in the form of remittance, in the form of mobile money, or all the advanced technologies to connect back with wherever they come from. So it tells you that the future, it's not just where they are, but also to connect with families across. So these are 2 points that I'll add on to the tools. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. I think these questions, these markers, really give us a sense of where to go next in the conversation. My sincere thanks to all three of you. Thank you for welcoming me into the conversation and allowing me to facilitate this discussion. We send our best wishes to Dr. Kweka and hope that she's better soon. But what a fantastic conversation. And I think from a starting point of the scale of the challenge, not only in this moment, but structurally, to really a discussion of, where we see that momentum for positive change coming from. And I think that's really the lesson that I take away from this. So to you, Susan and Paula and Mary, sincere thanks for your generosity and your insight. Let me say a big thank you to the audience who have stayed with us past our posted end time. That's always a sign of how engaging the discussion is, that our audience remains with us. Thank you to IDRC for the partnership in making this conversation possible, and a sincere thanks to Jaruxin, Nadia, and Montserrat for all of the support that you give. To Dr. Suchi Karim, who is doing such a tremendous role in facilitating all of this work. Let me just say a thank you to everyone for your engagement. Please look for the recording and a report from this webinar that will be posted on the chair's website in the coming weeks. We'll also see what other resources we can post on that website in response to one of the questions that was posed in the chat box. Let me just say, wherever you're joining us from, I hope you're safe and well. This is the fourth in the series of webinar series. Stay tuned for future activities of the IDRC research chairs. But wherever you are, stay well, and thank you for taking some time to be with us today for this important conversation. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Miigwech.
Bye.